floating in space, and that the wave was going to overtake me and carry me. I accepted it as unavoidable, but just before it hit me, something thoroughly unexpected happened. A wind blew me out of the wave's path. The force of that wind carried me with tremendous speed. I went through an immense tunnel of intense colored lights. My vision blurred completely, and then I felt that I was waking up, that I had been having a dream, a hypnotic dream brought about by Genaro. In the next instant, I was back in the room with Don Juan and Genaro. I slept most of the following day. In the late afternoon, Don Juan and I again sat down to talk. Genaro had been with me earlier, but had refused to comment on my experience.
Genaro again pushed your assemblage point last night, Don Juan said. But perhaps the shove was too forceful.
I eagerly told Don Juan the content of my vision. He smiled, obviously bored.
Your assemblage point moved away from its normal position, he said, and that made you perceive emanations that are not ordinarily perceived. Sounds like nothing, doesn't it? And yet, it is a supreme accomplishment that the new seers strive to elucidate.
He explained that human beings repeatedly choose the same emanations for perceiving because of two reasons. First, and most important, because we have been taught that those emanations are perceivable. And second, because our assemblage points select and prepare those emanations for being used.
Every living being has an assemblage point, he went on, which selects emanations for emphasis. Seers can see whether sentient beings share the same view of the world by seeing if the emanations their assemblage points have selected are the same.
He affirmed that one of the most important breakthroughs for the new seers was to find that the spot where that point is located on the cocoon of all living creatures is not a permanent feature, but is established on that specific spot by habit. Hence the tremendous stress the new seers put on new actions, on new practicalities. They want desperately to arrive at new usages, new habits.
The Nagual's blow is of great importance, he went on, because it makes that point move. It alters its location. Sometimes it even creates a permanent crevice there. The assemblage point is totally dislodged and awareness changes dramatically. But what is a matter of even greater importance is the proper understanding of the truths about awareness in order to realize that the point can be moved from within. The unfortunate truth is that human beings always lose by default. They simply don't know about their possibilities.
How can one accomplish that change from within? I asked.
The new seers say that realization is the technique, he said. They say that first of all, one must become aware that the world we perceive is the result of our assemblage points being located on a specific spot on the cocoon. Once that is understood, the assemblage point can move almost at will as a consequence of new habits.
I didn't quite understand what he meant by habits. I asked him to clarify his point.
The assemblage point of man appears around a definite area of the cocoon because the eagle commands it, he said. But the precise spot is determined by habit, by repetitious acts. First, we learn that it can be placed there, and then we ourselves command it to be there. Our command becomes the eagle's command, and that point is fixated at that spot. Consider this very carefully. Our command becomes the eagle's command. The old seers paid dearly for that finding. We'll come back to that later on.
He stated once again that the old seers had concentrated exclusively on developing thousands of the most complex techniques of sorcery. He added that what they never realized was that their intricate devices, as bizarre as they were, had no other value than being the means to break the fixation of their assemblage points and make them move. I asked him to explain what he had said.
I've mentioned to you that sorcery is something like entering a dead-end street, he replied. What I meant was that sorcery practices have no intrinsic value. Their worth is indirect, for their real function is to make the assemblage point shift by making the first attention release its control on that point. The new seers realized the true role those sorcery practices played and decided to go directly into the process of making their assemblage points shift, avoiding all the other nonsense of rituals and incantations. Yet rituals and incantations are indeed necessary at one time in every warrior's life. I personally have initiated you in all kinds of sorcery procedures, but only for purposes of luring your first attention away from the power of self-absorption, which keeps your assemblage point rigidly fixed.
He added that the obsessive entanglement of the first attention in self-absorption, or reason, is a powerful binding force, and that ritual behavior, because it is repetitive, forces the first attention to free some energy from watching the inventory, as a consequence of which the assemblage point loses its rigidity. What happens to the persons whose assemblage points lose rigidity? I asked.
If they're not warriors, they think they're losing their minds, he said, smiling, just as you thought you were going crazy at one time. If they're warriors, you know they've gone crazy, but they patiently wait. You see, to be healthy and sane means that the assemblage point is immovable. When it shifts, it literally means that one is deranged. He said that two options are opened to warriors whose assemblage points have shifted. One is to acknowledge being ill and to behave in deranged ways, reacting emotionally to the strange worlds that their shifts force them to witness. The other is to remain impassive, untouched, knowing that the assemblage point always returns to its original position. What if the assemblage point doesn't return to its original position? I asked. Then those people are lost, he said. They are either incurably crazy because their assemblage points could never assemble the world as we know it, or they are peerless seers who have begun their movement toward the unknown.
What determines whether it is one or the other?
Energy, impeccability. Impeccable warriors don't lose their marbles. They remain untouched. I've said to you many times that impeccable warriors may see horrifying worlds, and yet the next moment they are telling a joke, laughing with their friends or with strangers.
I said to him then what I had told him many times before, that what made me think I was ill was a series of disruptive sensorial experiences that I had had as after effects of ingesting hallucinogenic plants. I went through states of total space and time discordance, very annoying lapses of mental concentration, actual visions or hallucinations of places and people I would be staring at as if they really existed. I couldn't help thinking that I was losing my mind.
By all ordinary measures, you were indeed losing your mind, he said. But in the seer's view, if you had lost it, you wouldn't have lost much. The mind, for a seer, is nothing but the self-reflection of the inventory of man. If you lose that self-reflection but don't lose your underpinnings, you actually live an infinitely stronger life than if you had kept it.
He remarked that my flaw was my emotional reaction, which prevented me from realizing that the oddity of my sensorial experiences was determined by the depth to which my assemblage point had moved into man's band of emanations. I told him that I couldn't understand what he was explaining because the configuration that he had called man's band of emanations was something incomprehensible to me. I had pictured it to be like a ribbon placed on the surface of a ball. He said that calling it a band was misleading, and that he was going to use an analogy to illustrate what he meant. He explained that the luminous shape of man is like a ball of jack cheese with a thick disc of darker cheese injected into it. He looked at me and chuckled. He knew that I didn't like cheese. He made a diagram on a small blackboard. He drew an egg-like shape and divided it in 4 longitudinal sections, saying that he would immediately erase the division lines because he had drawn them only to give me an idea where the band was located in the cocoon of man. He then drew a thick band at the line between the first and second sections and erased the division lines. He explained that the band was like a disc of cheddar cheese that had been inserted into the ball of jack cheese. Now, if that ball of jack cheese were transparent, he went on, you would have the perfect replica of man's cocoon. The cheddar cheese goes all the way inside the ball of jack cheese. It's a disc that goes from the surface on one side to the surface on the other side. The assemblage point of man is located high up, 3/4 of the way toward the top of the egg on the surface of the cocoon. When a nagual presses on that point of intense luminosity, the point moves into the disc of the cheddar cheese. Heightened awareness comes about when the intense glow of the assemblage point lights up dormant emanations way inside the disc of cheddar cheese. To see the glow of the assemblage point moving inside that disc gives the feeling that it is shifting toward the left on the surface of the cocoon. He repeated his analogy 3 or 4 times, but I didn't understand it, and he had to explain it further. He said that the transparency of the luminous egg creates the impression of a movement toward the left, when in fact, every movement of the assemblage point is in depth into the center of the luminous egg along the thickness of man's band. I remarked that what he was saying made it sound as if seers would be using their eyes when they see the assemblage point move. Man is not the unknowable, he said. Man's luminosity can be seen almost as if one were using the eyes alone. He further explained that the old seers had seen the movement of the assemblage point, but it never occurred to them that it was a movement in depth. Instead, they followed their seeing and coined the phrase, shift to the left, which the new seers retained, although they knew that it was erroneous to call it a shift to the left. He also said that in the course of my activity with him, he had made my assemblage point move countless times, as was the case at that very moment. Since the shift of the assemblage point was always in depth, I had never lost my sense of identity, in spite of the fact that I was always using emanations I had never used before. When the nagual pushes that point, he went on, the point ends up any which way along man's band, but it absolutely doesn't matter where, because wherever it ends up is always virgin ground. The grand test that the new seers developed for their warrior apprentices is to retrace the journey that their assemblage points took under the influence of the nagual. This retracing, when it is completed, is called regaining the totality of oneself. He went on to say that the contention of the new seers is that in the course of our growth, once the glow of awareness focuses on man's band of emanations and selects some of them for emphasis, it enters into a vicious circle. The more it emphasizes certain emanations, the more stable the assemblage point gets to be. This is the equivalent to saying that our command becomes the eagle's command. It goes without saying that when our awareness develops into first attention, the command is so strong that to break that circle and make the assemblage point shift is a genuine triumph. Don Juan said that the assemblage point is also responsible for making the first attention perceive in terms of clusters. An example of a cluster of emanations that receive emphasis together is the human body as we perceive it. Another part of our total being, our luminous cocoon, never receives emphasis and is relegated to oblivion. For the effect of the assemblage point is not only to make us perceive clusters of emanations, but also to make us disregard emanations. When I pressed hard for an explanation of clustering, he replied that the assemblage point radiates a glow that groups together bundles of encased emanations. These bundles then become aligned as bundles with the emanations at large. Clustering is carried out even when seers deal with the emanations that are never used. Whenever they are emphasized, we perceive them just as we perceive the clusters of the first attention.
One of the greatest moments the new seers had, he continued, was when they found out that the unknown is merely the emanations discarded by the first attention. It's a huge affair, but an affair, mind you, where clustering can be done. The unknowable, on the other hand, is an eternity where our assemblage point has no way of clustering anything.
He explained that the assemblage point is like a luminous magnet that picks emanations and groups them together wherever it moves within the bounds of man's band of emanations. This discovery was the glory of the new seers, for it put the unknown in a new light. The new seers noticed that some of the obsessive visions of seers, the ones that were almost impossible to conceive, coincided with the shift of the assemblage point to the region of man's band, which is diametrically opposed to where it is ordinarily located.
Those were visions of the dark side of man,
he asserted. Why do you call it the dark side of man? I asked.
Because it is somber and foreboding, he said. It's not only the unknown, but the who cares to know it.
How about the emanations that are inside the cocoon, but out of the bounds of man's band? I asked. Can they be perceived?
Yes, but in really indescribable ways, he said. They're not the human unknown, as is the case with the unused emanations in the band of man, but the nearly immeasurable unknown where human traits do not figure at all. It is really an area of such an overpowering vastness that the best of seers would be hard put to describe it.
I insisted once more that it seemed to me that the mystery is obviously within us.
The mystery is outside us, he said. Inside us, we have only emanations trying to break the cocoon. And this fact aberrates us, one way or another, whether we're average men or warriors. Only the new seers get around this. They struggle to see, and by means of the shifts of their assemblage points, they get to realize that the mystery is perceiving. Not so much what we perceive, but what makes us perceive. I've mentioned to you that the new seers believe that our senses are capable of detecting anything. They believe this because they see that the position of the assemblage point is what dictates what our senses perceive. If the assemblage point aligns emanations inside the cocoon in a position different from its normal one, the human senses perceive in inconceivable ways.
Chapter 8. The Position of the Assemblage Point. The next time Don Juan resumed his explanations of the mastery of awareness, we were again at his house in southern Mexico. That house was actually owned by all the members of the Nagual's party, but Silvio Manuel officiated as the owner, and everyone openly referred to it as Silvio Manuel's house, although I, for some inexplicable reason, had gotten used to calling it Don Juan's house. Don Juan, Genaro, and I had returned to the house from a trip to the mountains. That day, as we relaxed after the long drive and ate a late lunch, I asked Don Juan the reason for the curious deception. He assured me that no deception was involved and that to call it Silvio Manuel's house was an exercise in the art of stalking, to be performed by all the members of the Nagual's party under any circumstances, even in the privacy of their own thoughts. For any of them to insist on thinking about the house in any other terms was tantamount to denying their links to the Nagual's party. I protested that he had never told me that. I didn't want to cause any dissension with my habits.
"Don't worry about it,"
he said, smiling at me and patting my back.
"You can call this house whatever you want. The Nagual has authority. The Nagual woman, for instance, calls it the House of Shadows."
Our conversation was interrupted, and I didn't see him until he sent for me to come to the back patio a couple of hours later. He and Genaro were strolling around at the far end of the corridor. I could see them moving their hands in what seemed to be an animated conversation. It was a clear, sunny day. The mid-afternoon sun shone directly on some of the flower pots that hung from the eaves of the roof around the corridor and projected their shadows on the north and east walls of the patio. The combination of intense yellow sunlight, the massive black shadows of the pots, and the lovely, delicate, bare shadows of the frail flowering plants that grew in them was stunning. Someone with a keen eye for balance and order had pruned those plants to create such an exquisite effect.
"The Nagual woman has done that,"
Don Juan said, as if reading my thoughts.
"She gazes at these shadows in the afternoons."
The thought of her gazing at shadows in the afternoons had a swift and devastating effect on me. The intense yellow light of that hour, the quietness of that town, and the affection that I felt for the Nagual woman conjured up for me in one instant all the solitude of the warrior's endless path. Don Juan had defined the scope of that path when he said to me that the new seers are the warriors of total freedom, that their only search is the ultimate liberation that comes when they attain total awareness. I understood with unimpaired clarity as I looked at those haunting shadows on the wall what it means to the Nagual woman when she said that to read poems out loud was the only release that her spirit had. I remember that the day before she had read something to me there in the patio, but I had not quite understood her urgency, her longing. It was a poem by Juan Ramón Jiménez, Hora Inmensa, which she told me synthesized for her the solitude of warriors who live to escape to total freedom. Only a bell and a bird break the stillness. It seems that the two talk with the setting sun. Golden-colored silence, the afternoon is made of crystals. A roving purity sways the cool trees, and beyond all that, a transparent river dreams that trampling over pearls, it breaks loose and flows into infinity. Don Juan and Genaro came to my side and looked at me with an expression of surprise. "What are we really doing, Don Juan?" I asked. "Is it possible that warriors are only preparing themselves for death?"
"No way,"
he said, gently patting my shoulder.
"Warriors prepare themselves to be aware, and full awareness comes to them only when there is no more self-importance left in them. Only when they are nothing do they become everything."
We were quiet for a moment. Then Don Juan asked me if I was in the throes of self-pity. I didn't answer because I wasn't sure.
"You're not sorry that you're here, are you?" Don Juan asked with a faint smile.
"He's certainly not," Genaro assured him. Then he seemed to have a moment of doubt. He scratched his head, then looked at me and arched his brows. "Maybe you are," he said. "Are you?"
"He's certainly not,"
Don Juan assured Genaro this time. He went through the same gestures of scratching his head and arching his brows.
"Maybe you are," he said. "Are you?"
"He's certainly not," Genaro boomed, and both of them exploded into uncontrolled laughter. When they had calmed down, Don Juan said that self-importance is the motivating force for every attack of melancholy. He added that warriors are entitled to have profound states of sadness, but that sadness is there only to make them laugh.
Genaro has something to show you, which is more exciting than all the self-pity you can muster up,
Don Juan continued.
It has to do with the position of the assemblage point.
Genaro immediately began to walk around the corridor, arching his back and lifting his thighs to his chest.
The Nagual Julian showed him how to walk that way,
Don Juan said in a whisper.
It's called the Gate of Power. Genaro knows several gates of power. Watch him fixedly.
Genaro's movements were indeed mesmeric. I found myself following his gait, first with my eyes and then irresistibly with my feet. I imitated his gait. We walked once around the patio and stopped. While walking, I had noticed the extraordinary lucidity that each step brought to me. When we stopped, I was in a state of keen alertness. I could hear every sound. I could detect every change in the light or in the shadows around me. I became enthralled with a feeling of urgency, of impending action. I felt extraordinarily aggressive, muscular, daring. At that moment, I saw an enormous span of flat land in front of me. Right behind me, I saw a forest. Huge trees were lined up straight as a wall. The forest was dark and green. The plain was sunny and yellow. My breathing was deep and strangely accelerated, but not in an abnormal way. Yet it was the rhythm of my breathing that was forcing me to trot on the spot. I wanted to take off running, or rather my body wanted to, but just as I was taking off, something stopped me. Don Juan and Genaro were suddenly by my side. We walked down the corridor with Genaro to my right. He nudged me with his shoulder. I felt the weight of his body on me. He gently shoved me to the left and we angled off straight for the east wall of the patio. For a moment I had the weird impression that we were going to go through the wall, and I even braced myself for the impact, but we stopped right in front of the wall. While my face was still against the wall, they both examined me with great care. I knew what they were searching for. They wanted to make sure that I had shifted my assemblage point. I knew that I had, because my mood had changed. They obviously knew it too. They gently took me by the arms and walked in silence with me to the other side of the corridor, to a dark passageway, a narrow hall that connected the patio with the rest of the house. We stopped there. Don Juan and Genaro moved a few feet away from me. I was left facing the side of the house that was in dark shadows. I looked into an empty, dark room. I had a sense of physical weariness. I felt languid, indifferent, and yet I experienced a sense of spiritual strength. I realized then that I had lost something. There was no strength in my body. I could hardly stand. My legs finally gave in and I sat down, and then I lay down on my side. While I lay there, I had the most wonderful, fulfilling thoughts of love for God, for goodness. Then, all at once, I was in front of the main altar of a church. The bas-reliefs covered with gold leaf glittered with the light of thousands of candles. I saw the dark figures of men and women carrying an enormous crucifix mounted on a huge palanquin. I moved out of their way and stepped outside the church. I saw a multitude of people, a sea of candles coming toward me. I felt elated. I ran to join them. I was moved by profound love. I wanted to be with them, to pray to the Lord. I was only a few feet away from the mass of people when something swished me away. The next instant, I was with Don Juan and Genaro. They flanked me as we walked lazily around the patio. While we were having lunch the next day, Don Juan said that Genaro had pushed my assemblage point with his gate of power. and that he had been able to do that because I had been in a state of inner silence. He explained that the articulation point of everything seers do is something he had talked about since the day we met: stopping the internal dialogue. He stressed over and over that the internal dialogue is what keeps the assemblage point fixed to its original position.
Once silence is attained, everything is possible, he said.
I told him I was very conscious of the fact that in general I had stopped talking to myself, but didn't know how I had done it. If asked to explain the procedure, I wouldn't know what to say.
The explanation is simplicity itself, he said. You willed it, and thus you set a new intent, a new command. Then your command became the eagle's command. This is one of the most extraordinary things that the new seers found out, that our command can become the eagle's command. The internal dialogue stops in the same way it begins, by an act of will. After all, we are forced to start talking to ourselves by those who teach us. As they teach us, they engage their will and we engage ours, both without knowing it. As we learn to talk to ourselves, we learn to handle will. We will ourselves to talk to ourselves. The way to stop talking to ourselves is to use exactly the same method. We must will it. We must intend it.
We were silent for a few minutes. I asked him to whom he was referring when he said that we had teachers who taught us to talk to ourselves.
I was talking about what happens to human beings when they are infants, he replied. A time when they are taught by everyone around them to repeat an endless dialogue about themselves. The dialogue becomes internalized, and that force alone keeps the assemblage point fixed. The new seers say that infants have hundreds of teachers who teach them exactly where to place their assemblage point.
He said that seers see that infants have no fixed assemblage point at first. Their encased emanations are in a state of great turmoil, and their assemblage points shift everywhere in the band of man, giving children a great capacity to focus on emanations that later will be thoroughly disregarded. Then, as they grow, the older humans around them, through their considerable power over them, force the children's assemblage points to become more steady by means of an increasingly complex internal dialogue. The internal dialogue is a process that constantly strengthens the position of the assemblage point, because that position is an arbitrary one and needs steady reinforcement.
The fact of the matter is that many children see, he went on. Most of those who see are considered to be oddballs, and every effort is made to correct them, to make them solidify the position of their assemblage points.
But would it be possible to encourage children to keep their assemblage points more fluid? I asked.
Only if they live among the new seers, he said. Otherwise, they would get entrapped, as the old seers did, in the intricacies of the silent side of man. And believe me, that's worse than being caught in the clutches of rationality.
Don Juan went on to express his profound admiration for the human capacity to impart order to the chaos of the eagle's emanations. He maintained that every one of us, in his own right, is a masterful magician, and that our magic is to keep our assemblage point unwaveringly fixed.
The force of the emanations at large, he went on, makes our assemblage point select certain emanations and cluster them for alignment and perception. That's the command of the eagle, but all the meaning that we give to what we perceive is our command, our gift of magic.
He said that in the light of what he had explained, what Genaro had made me do the day before was something extraordinarily complex, and yet very simple. It was complex because it required a tremendous discipline on everybody's part. It required that the internal dialogue be stopped, that a state of heightened awareness be reached, and that someone walk away with one's assemblage point. The explanation behind all these complex procedures was very simple. The new seers say that since the exact position of the assemblage point is an arbitrary position chosen for us by our ancestors, it can move with a relatively small effort. Once it moves, it forces new alignments of emanations, thus new perceptions.
I used to give you power plants in order to make your assemblage point move,
Don Juan continued.
Power plants have that effect, but hunger, tiredness, fever, and other things like that can have a similar effect. The flaw of the average man is that he thinks the result of a shift is purely mental. It isn't, as you yourself can attest.
He explained that my assemblage point had shifted scores of times in the past, just as it had shifted the day before, and that most of the time the worlds it had assembled had been so close to the world of everyday life as to be virtually phantom worlds. He emphatically added that visions of that kind are automatically rejected by the new seers.
Those visions are the product of man's inventory, he went on. They are of no value for warriors in search of total freedom because they are produced by a lateral shift of the assemblage point.
He stopped talking and looked at me. I knew that by lateral shift, he had meant a shift of the point from one side to the other along the width of man's band of emanations, instead of a shift in depth. I asked him if I was right.
That's exactly what I meant, he said. On both edges of man's band of emanations, there is a strange storage of refuse, an incalculable pile of human junk. It's a very morbid, sinister storehouse. It had great value for the old seers, but not for us. One of the easiest things one can do is to fall into it. Yesterday, Genaro and I wanted to give you a quick example of that lateral shift. That was why we walked to your assemblage point. But any person can reach that storehouse by simply stopping his internal dialogue. If the shift is minimal, the results are explained as fantasies of the mind. If the shift is considerable, the results are called hallucinations.
I asked him to explain the act of walking the assemblage point. He said that once warriors have attained inner silence by stopping their internal dialogue, the sound of the gate of power, more than the sight of it, is what traps their assemblage points. The rhythm of muffled steps instantly catches the alignment force of the emanations inside the cocoon, which has been disconnected by inner silence.
That force hooks itself immediately to the edges of the band, he went on. On the right edge, we find endless visions of physical activity, violence, killing, sensuality. On the left edge, we find spirituality, religion, God. Genaro and I walked your assemblage point to both edges so as to give you a complete view of that human junk pile.
Don Juan restated, as if on second thought, that one of the most mysterious aspects of the seer's knowledge is the incredible effects of inner silence. He said that once inner silence is attained, the bonds that tie the assemblage point to the particular spot where it is placed begin to break, and the assemblage point is free to move. He said that the movement ordinarily is toward the left, that such a directional preference is a natural reaction of most human beings, but that there are seers who can direct that movement to positions below the customary spot where the point is located. The new seers call that shift the shift below.
Seers also suffer accidental shifts below, he went on. The assemblage point doesn't remain there long, and that's fortunate because that is the place of the beast. To go below is counter to our interest, although the easiest thing to do.
Don Juan also said that among the many errors of judgment the old seers had committed, one of the most grievous was moving their assemblage points to the immeasurable area below, which made them experts at adopting animal forms. They chose different animals as their point of reference and called those animals their Nagua. They believed that by moving their assemblage points to specific spots, they would acquire the characteristics of the animal of their choice, its strength or wisdom or cunning or agility or ferocity. Don Juan assured me that there are many dreadful examples of such practices even among the seers of our day. The relative facility with which the assemblage point of man moves toward any lower position poses a great temptation to seers, especially to those whose inclination leans toward that end. It is the duty of a Nagual, therefore, to test his warriors. He told me then that he had put me to the test by moving my assemblage point to a position below while I was under the influence of a power plant. He then guided my assemblage point until I could isolate the crow's band of emanations, which resulted in my changing into a crow. I again asked Don Juan the question I had asked him dozens of times. I wanted to know whether I had physically turned into a crow or had merely thought and felt like one. He explained that a shift of the assemblage point to the area below always results in a total transformation. He added that if the assemblage point moves beyond a crucial threshold, the world vanishes. It ceases to be what it is to us at man's level. He conceded that my transformation was indeed horrifying by any standards. My reaction to that experience proved to him that I had no leanings toward that direction. Had it not been that way, I would have had to employ enormous energy in order to fight off a tendency to remain in that area below, which some seers find more comfortable. He further said that an unwitting downshift occurs periodically to every seer, but that such a downshift becomes less and less frequent as their assemblage points move farther toward the left. Every time it occurs, however, the power of a seer undergoing it diminishes considerably. It is a drawback that takes time and great effort to correct.
Those lapses make seers extremely morose and narrow-minded, he continued, and in certain cases, extremely rational.
How can seers avoid those downshifts? I asked.
It all depends on the warrior, he said. Some of them are naturally inclined to indulge in their quirks. Yourself, for instance. They are the ones who are hard hit. For those like you, I recommend a 24-hour vigil of everything they do. Disciplined men or women are less prone to that kind of shift. For those, I would recommend a 23-hour vigil.
He looked at me with shiny eyes and laughed.
Female seers have downshifts more often than males, he said, but they are also capable of bouncing out of that position with no effort at all, while males linger dangerously in it.
He also said that women seers have an extraordinary capacity to make their assemblage points hold on to any position in the area below. Men cannot. Men have sobriety and purpose, but very little talent. That is the reason why a Nagual must have 8 women seers in his party. Women give the impulse to cross the immeasurable vastness of the unknown. Together with that natural capacity, or as a consequence of it, women have a most fierce intensity. They can, therefore, reproduce an animal form with flair, ease, and a matchless ferocity.
If you think about scary things, he continued, about something unnameable lurking in the darkness, you're thinking, without knowing it, about a woman seer holding a position in the immeasurable area below. True horror lies right there. If you ever find an aberrant woman seer, run for the hills.
I asked him whether other organisms were capable of shifting their assemblage points.
Their points can shift, he said, but the shift is not a voluntary thing with them.
Is the assemblage point of other organisms also trained to appear where it does? I asked.
Every newborn organism is trained one way or another, he replied. We may not understand how their training is done. After all, we don't even understand how it is done to us. But seers see that the newborn are coaxed to do what their kind does. That's exactly what happens to human infants. Seers see their assemblage points shifting every which way, and then they see how the presence of adults fastens each point to one spot. The same happens to every other organism. Don Juan seemed to reflect for a moment and then added that there was indeed one unique effect that man's assemblage point has. He pointed to a tree outside. When we, as serious adult human beings, look at a tree, he said, our assemblage points align an infinite number of emanations and achieve a miracle. Our assemblage points make us perceive a cluster of emanations that we call tree. He explained that the assemblage point not only affects the alignment needed for perception, but also obliterates the alignment of certain emanations in order to arrive at a greater refinement of perception, a skimming, a tricky human construct with no parallel. He said that the new seers had observed that only human beings were capable of further clustering the clusters of emanations. He used the Spanish word for skimming, desnate, to describe the act of collecting the most palatable cream off the top of a container of boiled milk after it cools. Likewise, in terms of perception, man's assemblage point takes some part of the emanations already selected for alignment and makes a more palatable construct with it. The skimmings of men, Don Juan continued, are more real than what other creatures perceive. That is our pitfall. They are so real to us that we forget we have constructed them by commanding our assemblage points to appear where they do. We forget they are real to us only because it is our command to perceive them as real. We have the power to skim the top off the alignments, but we don't have the power to protect ourselves from our own commands. That has to be learned. To give our skimmings a free hand, as we do, is an error of judgment for which we pay as dearly as the old seers paid for theirs.
Chapter 9. The Shift Below. Don Juan and Genaro made their yearly trip to the northern part of Mexico, to the Sonoran Desert, to look for medicinal plants. One of the seers of the Nagual's party, Vicente Medrano, the herbalist among them, used those plants to make medicines. I had joined Don Juan and Genaro in Sonora at the last stage of their journey, just in time to drive them south, back to their home. The day before we started on our drive, Don Juan abruptly continued his explanation of the mastery of awareness. We were resting in the shade of some tall bushes in the foothills of the mountains. It was late afternoon, almost dark. Each of us carried a large burlap sack filled with plants. As soon as we had put them down, Genaro lay down on the ground and fell asleep, using his folded jacket as a pillow. Don Juan spoke to me in a low voice, as if he didn't want to wake up Genaro. He said that by now he had explained most of the truths about awareness, and that there was only one truth left to discuss. The last truth, he assured me, was the best of the old seers' findings, although they never knew that themselves. Its tremendous value was only recognized ages later by the new seers. I've explained to you that man has an assemblage point, he went on, and that the assemblage point aligns emanations for perception. We've also discussed that the point moves from its fixed position. Now, the last truth is that once that assemblage point moves beyond a certain limit, it can assemble worlds entirely different from the world we know. Still, in a whisper, he said that certain geographical areas not only help that precarious movement of the assemblage point, but also select specific directions for that movement. For instance, the Sonoran Desert helps the assemblage point move downward from its customary position to the place of the beast.
That's why there are true sorcerers in Sonora, he continued, especially sorceresses. You already know one, La Catalina. In the past, I have arranged bouts between the two of you. I wanted to make your assemblage point shift, and La Catalina, with her sorcery antics, jolted it loose.
Don Juan explained that the chilling experiences I had had with La Catalina had been part of a prearranged agreement between the two of them. "What would you think if we invited her to join us?" Genaro asked me in a loud voice as he sat up. The abruptness of his question and the strange sound of his voice plunged me into instant terror. Don Juan laughed and shook me by the arms. He assured me that there was no need for alarm. He said that La Catalina was like a cousin or an aunt to us. She was part of our world, although she didn't quite follow our quests. She was infinitely closer to the ancient seers. Genaro smiled and winked at me. "I understand that you've got hot pants for her," he said to me. "She herself confessed to me that every time you've had a confrontation with her, the greater your fright, the hotter your pants." Don Juan and Genaro laughed to near hysteria. I had to admit that somehow I had always found La Catalina to be a very scary but at the same time an extremely appealing woman. What impressed me the most about her was her exuding energy.
"She has so much energy saved," Don Juan commented, "that you didn't have to be in heightened awareness for her to move your assemblage point all the way to the depths of the left side."
Don Juan said again that La Catalina was very closely related to us because she belonged to the Nagual Julian's party. He explained that usually the Nagual and all the members of his party leave the world together, but that there are instances when they leave either in smaller groups or one by one. The Nagual Julian and his party were an example of the latter. Although he had left the world nearly 40 years ago, La Catalina was still here. He reminded me about something he mentioned to me before, that the Nagual Julian's party consisted of a group of 3 thoroughly inconsequential men and 8 superb women. Don Juan had always maintained that such a disparity was one of the reasons why the members of the Nagual Julian's party left the world one by one. He said that La Catalina had been attached to one of the superb women seers of the Nagual Julian's party, who taught her extraordinary maneuvers to shift her assemblage point to the area below. That seer was one of the last to leave the world. She lived to an extremely old age, and since both she and La Catalina were originally from Sonora, they returned in her advanced years to the desert and lived together until the seer left the world. In the years they spent together, La Catalina became her most dedicated helper and disciple, a disciple who was willing to learn the extravagant ways the old seers knew to make the assemblage point shift. I asked Don Juan if La Catalina's knowledge was inherently different from his own.
"We are exactly the same," he replied. "She's more like Silvio Manuel or Genaro. She is really the female version of them. But of course, being a woman, she's infinitely more aggressive and dangerous than both of them."
Genaro assented with a nod of his head. "Infinitely more," he said, and winked again. "Is she attached to your party?" I asked Don Juan.
"I said that she's like a cousin or an aunt to us," he replied. "I meant she belongs to the older generation, although she's younger than all of us. She is the last of that group. She is rarely in contact with us. She doesn't quite like us. We're too stiff for her, because she's used to the Nagual Julian's touch. She prefers the high adventure of the unknown to the quest for freedom."
"What's the difference between the two?" I asked Don Juan.
"In the last part of my explanation of the truths about awareness," he replied, "we are going to discuss that difference, slowly and thoroughly. What's important for you to know at this moment is that you're jealously guarding weird secrets in your left side awareness. That is why La Catalina and you like each other.
I insisted again that it was not that I liked her, it was rather that I admired her great strength. Don Juan and Genaro laughed and patted me as if they knew something I did not. She likes you because she knows what you're like, Genaro said and smacked his lips. She knew the Nagual Julian very well. Both of them gave me a long look that made me feel embarrassed. What are you driving at? I asked Genaro in a belligerent tone. He grinned at me and moved his eyebrows up and down in a comical gesture, but he kept quiet. Don Juan spoke and broke the silence.
There are very strange points in common between the Nagual Julian and you, he said. Genaro is just trying to figure out if you're aware of it.
I asked both of them how on earth I would be aware of something so far-fetched.
La Catalina thinks you are, Genaro said. She says so because she knew the Nagual Julian better than any of us here.
I commented that I couldn't believe that she knew the Nagual Julian since he had left the world nearly 40 years ago.
La Catalina is no spring chicken, Genaro said.
She just looks young. That's part of her knowledge. Just as it was part of the Nagual Julian's knowledge. You've seen her only when she looks young. If you see her when she looks old, she'll scare the living daylights out of you.
What La Catalina does, Don Juan interrupted, can be explained only in terms of the three masteries: the mastery of awareness, the mastery of stalking, and the mastery of intent. But today, we are going to examine what she does only in light of the last truth about awareness. The truth that says that the assemblage point can assemble worlds different from our own after it moves from its original position.
Don Juan signaled me to get up. Genaro also stood up. I automatically grabbed the burlap sack filled with medicinal plants. Genaro stopped me as I was about to put it on my shoulders.
"Leave the sack alone," he said, smiling. "We have to take a little hike up the hill and meet La Catalina."
"Where is she?" I asked.
"Up there," Genaro said, pointing to the top of a small hill. "If you stare with your eyes half closed, you'll see her as a very dark spot against the green shrubbery."
I strained to see the dark spot, but I couldn't see anything.
"Why don't you walk up there?"
Don Juan suggested to me. I felt dizzy and sick to my stomach. Don Juan urged me with a movement of his hand to go up, but I didn't dare move. Finally, Genaro took me by the arm, and both of us climbed toward the top of the hill. When we got there, I realized that Don Juan had come up right behind us. The three of us reached the top at the same time. Don Juan very calmly began to talk to Genaro. He asked him if he remembered the many times the Nagual Julian was about to choke both of them to death because they indulged in their fears. Genaro turned to me and assured me that the Nagual Julian had been a ruthless teacher. He and his own teacher, the Nagual Elias, who was still in the world then, used to push everyone's assemblage points beyond a crucial limit and let them fend for themselves.
"I once told you that the Nagual Julian recommended us not to waste our sexual energy," Genaro went on. "He meant that for the assemblage point to shift, one needs energy. If one doesn't have it, the Nagual's blow is not the blow of freedom, but the blow of death."
"Without enough energy," Don Juan said, "the force of alignment is crushing. You have to have energy to sustain the pressure of alignments, which never take place under ordinary circumstances." Genaro said that the Nagual Julian was an inspiring teacher. He always found ways to teach and, at the same time, entertain himself. One of his favorite teaching devices was to catch them unawares once or twice in their normal awareness and make their assemblage points shift. From then on, all he had to do to have their undivided attention was to threaten them with an unexpected Nagual's blow.
"The Nagual Julian was really an unforgettable man," Don Juan said. "He had a great touch with people. He would do the worst things in the world, but done by him, they were great. Done by anyone else, they would have been crude and callous." The Nagual Elias, on the other hand, had no touch, but he was indeed a great, great teacher.
The Nagual Elias was very much like the Nagual Juan Matus, Genaro said to me. They got along very fine, and the Nagual Elias taught him everything without ever raising his voice or playing tricks on him. But the Nagual Julian was quite different, Genaro went on, giving me a friendly shove. I'd say that he jealously guarded strange secrets in his left side, just like you. Wouldn't you say so? He asked to Don Juan. Don Juan didn't answer, but nodded affirmatively. He seemed to be holding back his laughter.
He had a playful nature,
Don Juan said, and both of them broke into a great laughter. The fact that they were obviously alluding to something they knew made me feel even more threatened. Don Juan matter-of-factly said that they were referring to the bizarre sorcery techniques that the Nagual Julian had learned in the course of his life. Genaro added that the Nagual Julian had a unique teacher besides the Nagual Elias, a teacher who had liked him immensely and had taught him novel and complex ways of moving his assemblage point. As a result of this, the Nagual Julian was extraordinarily eccentric in his behavior. Who was that teacher, Don Juan? I asked. Don Juan and Genaro looked at each other and giggled like two children.
That is a very tough question to answer,
Don Juan replied.
All I can say is that he was the teacher that deviated the course of our line. He taught us many things, good and bad, but among the worst, he taught us what the old seers did. So, some of us got trapped. The Nagual Julian was one of them, and so is La Catalina. We only hope that you won't follow them.
I immediately began to protest. Don Juan interrupted me. He said that I didn't know what I was protesting. As Don Juan spoke, I became terribly angry with him and Genaro. Suddenly, I was raging, yelling at them at the top of my voice. My reaction was so out of tone with me that it scared me. It was as if I were someone else. I stopped and looked at them for help. Genaro had his hands on Don Juan's shoulders as if he needed support. Both of them were laughing uncontrollably. I became so despondent I was nearly in tears. Don Juan came to my side. He reassuringly put his hand on my shoulder. He said that the Sonoran Desert, for reasons incomprehensible to him, fostered definite belligerence in man or any other organism.
People say that it's because the air is too dry here, he continued, or because it's too hot. Seers would say that there is a particular confluence of the eagle's emanations here, which, as I've already said, helps the assemblage point to shift below. Be that as it may, warriors are in the world to train themselves to be unbiased witnesses, so as to understand the mystery of ourselves and relish the exultation of finding what we really are. This is the highest of the new seer's goals, and not every warrior attains it. We believe that the Nagual Julian didn't attain it. He was waylaid, and so was La Catalina.
He further said that to be a peerless Nagual, one has to love freedom, and one has to have supreme detachment. He explained that what makes the warrior's path so very dangerous is that it is the opposite of the life situation of modern man. He said that modern man has left the realm of the unknown and the mysterious, and has settled down in the realm of the functional. He has turned his back to the world of the foreboding and the exulting, and has welcomed the world of boredom.
To be given a chance to go back again to the mystery of the world, Don Juan continued, is sometimes too much for warriors, and they succumb. They are waylaid by what I've called the high adventure of the unknown. They forget the quest for freedom. They forget to be unbiased witnesses. They sink into the unknown and love it.
And you think I'm like that, don't you? I asked Don Juan.
We don't think, we know,
Genaro replied.
And La Catalina knows better than anyone else.
Why would she know it? I demanded.
Because She's like you, Genaro replied, pronouncing his words with a comical intonation.
I was about to get into a heated argument again when Don Juan interrupted me.
There's no need to get so worked up, he said to me. You are what you are. The fight for freedom is harder for some. You are one of them. In order to be unbiased witnesses, he went on, we begin by